Ma'am, you need to go to the back. First class is not for people like you.
Are you sure?
Mom, you need to move. This seat isn't for you. The sentence landed harder than it should have. Not loud, not shouted, but sharp, clean, meant to cut. For a brief second, the entire first-class cabin went still. The soft clink of glass stopped. A man halfway through a sip of sparkling water froze with the rim touching his lips. Somewhere behind, a seatbelt clicked open and then closed again, uncertain. Ashley Carter stood in the aisle, posture straight, chin slightly raised. Her voice carried just enough authority to sound official, just enough edge to sound personal. In seat 2A, Margaret Hayes looked up slowly. She didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't react the way people usually do when they're called out in public. Her eyes met Ashley's, calm, clear, almost patient. There was a pause, long enough to feel uncomfortable, short enough that no one stepped in. Margaret closed the thick manual resting on her lap. The cover was worn, edges softened by time and use, not a novel, not a magazine. Something technical, dense. "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice low, even. "Is there a problem?" Ashley didn't smile. She didn't soften. She pointed. Not aggressively, but directly. "Yes, there is. This is a first-class seat." Another pause. The implication didn't need explanation. Around them, eyes started to move. Quietly, carefully, like people watching something they knew they shouldn't, but couldn't look away from. Margaret glanced down at her boarding pass, still tucked neatly inside her jacket pocket, then back up. "I understand," she said, "and I believe there may have been a last-minute change at the gate." Her tone was respectful, controlled, no hint of challenge. That, more than anything, irritated Ashley. Because in Ashley's experience, people who were wrong usually showed it. They got defensive, or embarrassed, or loud. Margaret did none of those things. She just stayed still. Ashley crossed her arms. "I checked the system," she said. "Your assigned seat is in economy, row 38. She emphasized the number slightly. Not enough to be obvious, enough to be heard. A few heads nodded. Linda Walker, seated one row ahead, leaned slightly toward her husband. Not whispering, not really. "In my day," she murmured, "people knew where they belonged." Her husband didn't respond. He just kept watching. Across the aisle, Richard Collins adjusted his cufflinks. Slow, deliberate. He studied Margaret the way he would evaluate a deal. Quick assessment, surface level, decision made. "Not one of us." Margaret heard them. Of course she did, but her expression didn't change. She reached into her jacket and handed her boarding pass to Ashley without hesitation. Ashley took it, looked down. Flight number, correct. Date, correct. Seat, 38C. Ashley's lips pressed together. There it was, proof. "I thought so," she said, a little louder now, enough for the surrounding seats to hear. "Mom, you're in the wrong section." She handed the pass back, but didn't release it immediately. Just held it for a second longer than necessary. A silent reinforcement. Margaret took it gently. No tension, no pull, just acceptance. "I see," Margaret said. Then, after a beat, "There may still be a note on the system. If you could check with Captain Brooks, he might be aware of the change." That did it. Ashley let out a short breath through her nose. Not quite a laugh. Not quite disbelief. "I don't need to check with the captain for a seating issue," she replied. Her voice tightened. "This is straightforward." The words hung there. Straightforward. Simple. Clear. Margaret looked at her, really looked this time. Not confrontational, not submissive, assessing. There was something in that look that didn't fit the situation. Something that didn't belong in a quiet passenger being told to move. Something steady, measured. Ashley felt it and didn't like it because it made her feel uncertain. And Ashley Carter did not like uncertainty. Not in her cabin, not on her flight. Behind them, a phone lifted slightly. Sophie Turner, seated near the aisle in row 4, angled her screen just enough to capture the exchange. Her thumb hovered over the record button for half a second, then pressed. The small red light blinked on. Back in seat 2A, Margaret folded her hands over the manual. "If there's confusion," she said, "I prefer we resolve it quietly, without disturbing everyone." Her voice was still soft, but now there was something else under it. Not authority, not yet. Something close. Ashley straightened. Mom, what's disturbing everyone is that you're refusing to follow instructions. The tone had shifted, subtle, but real. This wasn't customer service anymore. This was control. Margaret didn't move, didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. She just sat there, holding Ashley's gaze. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The cabin air felt heavier, thicker, like pressure building before something breaks. Around them, people shifted in their seats, pretending not to stare, failing, because everyone understood what this was now. Not a mistake, not a mix-up, a judgment, made quickly, accepted easily, enforced confidently. Margaret finally nodded once, slow, deliberate. I understand your position, she said. Then she paused, just long enough. But I would still recommend you verify. Ashley's jaw tightened, and in that moment, something invisible snapped into place. A line drawn, not loud, not dramatic, but final. The kind of line people don't notice until they've already crossed it. Ashley didn't step back. She stayed right there in the aisle, blocking the space, holding the moment in place like she owned it. Mom, I'm not going to repeat myself again, she said. Slower now, each word more deliberate. You need to gather your things and move to your assigned seat. A few seats behind, someone shifted, the leather creaking softly. The low hum of the aircraft systems filled the silence between sentences. It felt louder now, like everything else had faded. Margaret didn't move. Her hands rested lightly on the closed manual. Fingers still, relaxed, no tension in them. That, more than anything, unsettled Ashley. Because people who were caught usually moved. They apologized. They explained. They tried to fix it. Margaret did none of that. She just stayed exactly where she was. I'm not refusing, Margaret said quietly. I'm asking you to confirm. Ashley let out a breath, sharper this time. There's nothing to confirm. Her voice carried now, not loud, but firm enough that it reached the surrounding rows. This is not a discussion. This is a policy issue. Across the aisle, Richard Collins leaned back in his seat, crossing one leg over the other. He watched like it was a meeting that had gone off script. This is how it starts, he muttered, just loud enough for the woman next to him to hear. You let one person bend the rules, then everyone thinks they can. Linda Walker nodded immediately. Exactly, she said. Standards matter. Otherwise, what are we even paying for? Their words slid into the air like quiet approvals. Ashley heard them and straightened just a little more. Authority reinforced. Margaret heard them too. She didn't look at them. But something in her eyes shifted, just slightly, not anger, not hurt, recognition, like she had heard this tone before, in other places, other rooms, other situations, and knew exactly how it always played out. From row 4, Sophie adjusted her grip on her phone. The screen glowed faintly in her hand. Comments were already starting to appear. This is uncomfortable. Why is she not moving? This feels wrong. Sophie swallowed. Her heart was beating faster than it should have. Not from fear, from instinct. Something about this didn't sit right. Back at the center of it, Ashley took a small step forward, closing the distance. Mom, she said, lowering her voice slightly, as if that made it more professional. If you don't comply, I'll have to escalate this. Margaret finally leaned back a fraction, not retreating, just adjusting. I understand escalation, she said. A pause. Then softer. I've spent most of my life around it. Ashley blinked, just for a second. The sentence didn't fit. It didn't belong in this space. But she pushed past it. That doesn't change what's happening right now, Ashley replied. You're in a seat you didn't pay for. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Is that what you believe this is about? Ashley didn't answer, because the answer felt too simple, too obvious. And yet, something in Margaret's tone made it feel incomplete. Before Ashley could respond, a voice came from behind. What's going on here? Rachel Adams stepped into the aisle, her presence immediate, controlled, experienced. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The room adjusted to her. Ashley turned slightly, relief flashing across her face. Unauthorized seating, she said quickly. Economy passenger in first class, refusing to move. Rachel's eyes moved to Margaret. Quick scan, clothes, bag, posture. Same conclusion, different delivery. Mom, Rachel said, her tone smooth but firm. We need to resolve this immediately so we can prepare for departure. Margaret met her gaze. I agree, she said. Then she added, just as calmly, that's why I've asked for this to be verified with the captain. Rachel's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes hardened. The captain is busy with pre-flight procedures, she said. This is not something that requires his involvement. Margaret nodded once, as if she expected that answer. I see. A beat passed. Then Rachel continued. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to collect your belongings and move to your assigned seat. Now. The word landed heavier than the rest. Now. Final. Around them, the tension tightened. People leaned forward slightly, waiting, because this was the moment, either compliance or something else. Margaret looked down at her hands, then at the manual, then back up. Her eyes moved slowly from Rachel to Ashley to the surrounding faces. She saw it all, the certainty, the quiet judgment, the lack of doubt, and then she spoke. I want to be clear, she said. Her voice was still soft, but now it carried. You're making this decision without verifying the information I've given you. Rachel didn't hesitate. Yes, no apology, no uncertainty, just a decision. Margaret held her gaze for a long second, then nodded again once, slow, understood. The shift was subtle, but real, because in that moment something changed. Not in the room. In Margaret, she reached down, picked up her bag, not rushed, not defeated, just deliberate. Ashley stepped back slightly, making space. Rachel watched closely. Margaret stood, and when she did, the difference became visible. Not in her clothes, not in her posture, in her presence. It was quiet, but it filled the space. For a brief second, even the murmurs stopped. Margaret adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, then looked at Rachel one last time. You may want to remember this moment, she said. Not a threat, not even a warning, just a statement. Rachel didn't respond because there was nothing to respond to. From her perspective, the situation was already resolved. Margaret stepped into the aisle and began to walk, slow, steady, every step measured. As she passed each row, eyes followed her, some satisfied, some uncomfortable, some avoiding her completely. Linda watched her go, lips pressed thin. That's how it should be, she said quietly. Richard nodded. Order matters. Behind them, Sophie kept recording. Her throat felt tight now, because something about the way Margaret walked didn't feel like someone being removed. It felt like someone allowing it. And that difference was everything. At the front of the cabin, Ashley exhaled. Relief, control restored, situation handled. She smoothed her uniform, glancing briefly at Rachel. Rachel gave a small nod, approval, but neither of them noticed the silence that followed Margaret down the aisle, or the way the air seemed to shift behind her, or the feeling that something important had just been missed. Margaret didn't look back. She walked past the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the plane, and the air changed the moment she crossed it. The lighting was harsher here, the seats tighter, the space louder, more alive. Conversations didn't pause the same way. People didn't pretend not to look. They just looked. A man in a baseball cap lifted his eyes as she passed. A mother shifted her child closer to the window. A flight attendant near the galley glanced up, then quickly back down at her checklist. Margaret moved through it all without slowing. No hesitation, no embarrassment, just that same steady rhythm in her steps. Behind her, the curtain swayed once, then settled, and just like that, first class disappeared from view. Up front, Ashley Carr adjusted her stance again, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her uniform. Her shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. Crisis handled. That was how she saw it. Rachel Adams had already turned away, scanning the cabin with a practiced eye, checking overhead bins, seat belts, faces, making sure everything looked the way it should. Order restored. But Sophie hadn't stopped recording. Her phone was still angled low, capturing the empty seat in 2A, the untouched glass of water on the tray table, the indentation in the seat where Margaret had been sitting just moments ago. The absence felt louder than the argument. Sophie swallowed, then shifted her camera slightly, catching Ashley in the frame. Excuse me, Sophie said, her voice controlled but tight. Can I ask something? Ashley turned, polite smile snapping back into place. Of course, Mom. Sophie held her gaze. Did you actually check what she said? Ashley's smile held, but her eyes cooled. I verified her boarding pass, she replied. That's standard procedure. That's not what I asked. The tension slipped back into the air. Not as loud as before, but sharper, more focused. Rachel glanced over. Ashley straightened. There was no record of any upgrade or change, she said. We follow the system. That's how safety and fairness are maintained. Sophie nodded slowly, but she didn't look convinced. Sometimes systems are wrong, she said quietly. Ashley didn't respond, because in her world, systems weren't wrong. People were. Behind them, Richard Collins let out a soft breath through his nose. This is getting ridiculous, he muttered. Are we really questioning basic procedures now? Linda leaned forward again, her voice calm but firm. You can't run an airline on feelings, she said. There are rules for a reason. Sophie turned slightly, just enough to look at them. And there's a reason people get hurt when those rules are applied without thinking, she replied. Silence, not agreement, not conflict. Just that uncomfortable middle space where no one wanted to push further. Rachel stepped in before it could grow. That's enough, she said, not loud, but final. This matter is resolved. Her tone didn't invite discussion. Ashley nodded once, grateful for the intervention. The moment closed, or at least that's how it looked. Back in the main cabin, Margaret reached row 38, seat 38C, middle seat. She paused for a second, not because she didn't want to sit, but because she was listening. The engines outside hummed steadily, a low, constant vibration that ran through the floor, through the frame, into the body if you paid attention long enough. Most people didn't. Margaret did. She slid into the seat, placing her bag carefully under the one in front of her, adjusted the manual on her lap, fastened her seatbelt. Simple movements, routine. But her attention wasn't on the seat. It was on the sound, a subtle shift in pitch, a slight unevenness in the rhythm, barely noticeable, unless you knew what to listen for. The man beside her glanced over. Rough day? He asked, half sympathetic, half curious. Margaret turned her head slightly, met his eyes. Not yet, she said. He blinked, didn't quite understand, but nodded anyway. Across the aisle, a young flight attendant moved quickly, checking rows, speaking softly to passengers. Her smile was practiced, efficient, but her eyes flicked once toward Margaret, curiosity, then away. Margaret looked down at her hands. They were steady, always had been, even in worse situations than this, much worse. She rested them lightly on the manual again, then opened it, flipping to a marked page without looking, not reading, just grounding. Up front, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, a signal. Boarding complete, doors closing soon. Ashley took her jump seat, securing the harness across her shoulders. Her breathing had evened out now, back to routine, back to control. Rachel stood near the galley, speaking quietly into the interphone, coordinating with the cockpit. Her voice was calm, professional, no trace of what had just happened, because in her mind, nothing significant had happened. Just another passenger issue, handled, finished. But in row 4, Sophie lowered her phone slowly. She didn't stop the recording, she just lowered it, because something didn't feel finished, not even close. She looked toward the curtain again, then back at the empty seats, then down at her screen where comments were still coming in. That didn't sit right. Why wouldn't they just check? Something's off. Sophie exhaled slowly. Her instincts had been right before. They were right now. This wasn't over. Not for her, not for that woman, and maybe not for anyone on this plane. Back in seat 38C, Margaret lifted her eyes slightly, just enough to glance forward, toward the front of the aircraft, toward the cockpit. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened, focused, measured, like someone quietly recalculating, because whatever had just happened back there wasn't the problem. It was just the beginning. The aircraft door closed with a dull, final thud, a sound most passengers barely noticed. Margaret did. Her eyes lifted slightly, not toward the door, but toward the subtle shift that followed, pressure equalizing, systems engaging, the aircraft preparing to move. She listened again. The engine hum deepened, smooth at first, Then a faint irregularity, not loud, not dramatic, just off. The man beside her leaned back, adjusting his seatbelt. Finally, he muttered, "Thought we were going to be here all night." Margaret didn't answer. Her focus stayed on the sound, a low vibration under her feet, slightly uneven, like a rhythm that missed a beat every few cycles. Most people wouldn't notice. Most people weren't trained to. Up front, Ashley Carter went through the safety checks, her voice steady as she recited instructions she had delivered hundreds of times. Seatbelts fastened, tray tables up, electronic devices in airplane mode, routine, predictable, controlled. Rachel Adams stood near the forward galley, scanning the cabin one last time before takeoff. Her eyes moved quickly, efficiently. Nothing out of place, nothing to question, because in her mind, anything that needed questioning had already been handled. In row 4, Sophie Turner didn't put her phone away. She lowered it, yes, but her thumb hovered near the screen, watching, waiting. Her gaze flicked between the front of the cabin and the curtain. Something about that empty seat still bothered her, not the seat itself. The way it became empty, too fast, too certain. Back in row 38, Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment, not to rest, to focus. She replayed the sound in her head, compared it, measured it, there, again, that slight lag in the engine cycle. Her fingers tapped lightly against the manual, once, twice, not nervous. Calculating, the aircraft began to move. A slow pushback from the gate. The floor shifted beneath them. A subtle roll backward, then a pause. Margaret opened her eyes. Her gaze lifted again, this time toward the ceiling panels. Listening deeper now, hydraulic systems, electrical flow, air circulation, all of it forming a pattern only she seemed to hear. Beside her, the man glanced over again. "You okay?" he asked. "You look like you're listening to something." Margaret turned her head slightly. "I am," she said. He chuckled softly. "Hope it's good news." Margaret didn't smile. "Not yet," she replied. The man's expression faded, not because of the words, because of how she said them. Calm, certain, like she wasn't guessing. Up front, Ashley finished her checks and took her seat for taxi. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, her breathing even. She felt good. The situation earlier, resolved, handled correctly. That was how she framed it, because questioning it would mean questioning herself. And Ashley Carter didn't do that. Not easily. Rachel picked up the interphone again, speaking briefly with the cockpit. Cabin secure. Her voice was steady, professional. She didn't mention the incident, because it didn't matter. Not anymore. The plane began to taxi. A slow, controlled movement along the runway. The engines adjusted, their tone shifting slightly as power increased. Margaret's head tilted just a fraction. There it was again, that unevenness. More noticeable now, still subtle, still easy to dismiss, but it shouldn't be there. Not on a system this well maintained, not before takeoff. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in fear, in focus. Across the aisle, a young mother tried to calm her child, who had started to fuss. "It's okay," she whispered. "We're just moving." The child didn't settle. Something in the air felt different, even if no one could explain why. In first class, Richard Collins poured himself another drink, completely at ease now. "Back on schedule," he said, almost to himself. Linda nodded. "Good. I have a meeting tomorrow morning. Can't afford delays." They had already moved on. The moment forgotten, filed away as a minor inconvenience. That was the thing about people like them. They didn't sit with discomfort. They erased it, replaced it with certainty. Back in row 4, Sophie leaned slightly toward the aisle, trying to get a better view forward. She couldn't see Margaret anymore, but she could feel the absence, like a missing piece in a picture that didn't quite make sense. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. More comments, more reactions. People were watching, judging, just like the passengers had. The difference was, out there, some of them were questioning it. In here, no one was. The aircraft turned, lining up for takeoff, engines building power, a deeper roar now. Stronger, more force. Margaret's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the manual, not panic, awareness. The vibration increased, normal. Then, not quite, a slight shudder, barely noticeable, but it wasn't consistent. Her eyes lifted again, toward the front, toward the cockpit. Distance mattered now, and she felt it. For the first time since she sat down in seat 38C, Margaret Hayes looked concerned. Not for herself, for everyone. Up front, Ashley felt the power surge as the engines pushed harder. She pressed back into her seat. Routine, familiar, safe. Rachel glanced toward the cabin one last time. Everything looked normal, but something felt off. Just a flicker, a thought she pushed aside immediately, because there was nothing visible, nothing concrete. And in her world, if you couldn't see it, it didn't exist. The plane paused for a brief second. Then the engines roared. Full thrust, acceleration. Margaret closed her eyes again, just for a heartbeat, listening, measuring, confirming. And when she opened them, the calm in her expression was still there, but now it carried something else. Decision. Because whatever was wrong was about to reveal itself. And when it did, it wouldn't ask permission. The engines roared harder, the aircraft surged forward. Passengers pressed back into their seats as the acceleration built. Steady at first, then stronger, pushing them into the moment where everything became noise and motion and force. Margaret didn't look out the window. She listened. The sound was wrong. Not dramatically, not enough for panic, but enough. Enough for someone who knew what right was supposed to sound like. A low grinding undertone, almost hidden beneath the roar. A hesitation in the engine cycle, a fraction of a second where the rhythm slipped. Her fingers tightened once on the armrest, then released. Up front, Ashley Carter kept her gaze forward, hands gripping the edge of her jump seat. Takeoff always came with intensity, but this felt heavier. She shifted slightly, a small adjustment, like something didn't settle quite right in her chest. Beside her, Rachel Adams didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed down the aisle, counting rows, scanning faces, professional, controlled, but her jaw tightened. Just a little, because she felt it too. Not a thought, not a conclusion, just a feeling. The plane hit rotation speed, the nose lifted, the ground dropped away. And for a second, everything felt normal. Then it happened, a sharp jolt, not violent, but sudden, like something caught and released at the same time. A ripple ran through the cabin. Several passengers gasped. A glass tipped over in first class, liquid spilling across a tray table.
What was that?
Linda's voice cut through the air, tighter now. Richard frowned, gripping his armrest. Probably turbulence, he said quickly. Too quickly. Margaret's eyes opened fully. No, not turbulence. The sound changed again, higher pitched now, strained, like something working harder than it should. Her head turned slightly toward the wing. She didn't need to see it, she could hear it. Behind her, the young mother clutched her child closer. It's okay, she whispered again. But her voice wasn't steady anymore. The child started crying, louder this time. In row 4, Sophie sat up straighter. Her phone was already in her hand, recording again. Instinct. The aircraft climbed, but not smoothly. There was a subtle unevenness now, a slight roll. Corrected quickly, but not clean. Up front, Ashley swallowed. Her training kicked in. Stay calm. Follow procedure. Trust the system. But her hands tightened on the straps across her shoulders, because something wasn't right. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her voice low. Did you feel that? Ashley nodded. Yeah. A beat passed. Neither of them spoke again, because acknowledging it out loud made it real, and they weren't ready for that yet. In the cockpit, alarms hadn't sounded. Not yet, but indicators had shifted. Subtle changes. Numbers drifting outside ideal margins. Captain Daniel Brooks leaned forward in his seat, eyes locked on the instrument panel. Do you see that? He asked. First Officer Mark Ellis was already adjusting controls, his movements precise. I see it. His voice was controlled, but tight. Engine readings fluctuating, temperature slightly elevated, pressure inconsistent. Nothing catastrophic, but not stable, and not something you ignore. Back in row 38, Margaret unbuckled her seatbelt. The click was quiet, but deliberate. The man beside her turned quickly. Hey, you're supposed to stay seated. Margaret didn't look at him, I know. Her voice was calm. Too calm, she stood. The aircraft shifted slightly beneath her feet. She adjusted instantly. Balanced, like she had done it before. Many times. A flight attendant from the rear galley noticed immediately. Mom, you need to sit down right now. Margaret stepped into the aisle. Steady, focused. I need to speak to the cockpit. The attendant blinked, thrown off. That's not possible. You need to return to your seat. Margaret kept moving, not fast, but not stopping. Up front, Ashley saw the movement first. Her eyes widened slightly. Rachel turned, saw Margaret walking forward. Her expression hardened instantly. Mom, sit down immediately. Her voice cut through the cabin. Sharp, commanding. Passengers turned again. The tension snapped back into place, stronger than before. Margaret didn't stop, didn't argue, just kept walking, step by step, controlled. Rachel stood up, blocking the aisle. You need to sit down now. Margaret stopped in front of her, close enough that Rachel could see her eyes clearly. There was no panic in them, no confusion, just certainty. And that unsettled her more than anything else. There's a problem with the left engine, Margaret said. Quiet, direct. Rachel froze for half a second, then shook her head. You don't know that. Margaret held her gaze. I do. Ashley stood up now too, her voice sharper. This is not the time for this. Sit down or we will restrain you. A few passengers gasped. The word hung in the air. Restrain. Margaret didn't react, but her tone changed. Just slightly, lower, more grounded. Every second you delay matters. Rachel felt something shift in her chest. Not belief, not yet, but doubt, small, unwanted. Behind them, the aircraft shuddered again, stronger this time. A low vibration ran through the floor. Sophie's phone shook slightly in her hand. She didn't stop recording. Something's wrong, she whispered, not to anyone, to herself. Back at the front, Rachel hesitated, just for a moment, and Margaret saw it. That crack, that hesitation, that opening. Let me through, Margaret said. Not a request, not a command. Something else, something heavier, something earned. Rachel's breath caught, because for the first time since this started, she wasn't sure she was in control anymore. Rachel didn't move. For a second, maybe less, the world narrowed to the space between her and Margaret. The aisle felt tighter, the air heavier. Behind them, the aircraft vibrated again, not violently, but deeper now. A low tremor that ran through the structure, like a warning that hadn't found its voice yet. Ashley stepped forward. This is your last warning, she said. Her voice was firm, but it carried a strain that hadn't been there before. Margaret didn't even look at her. Her eyes stayed on Rachel. Listen to the engine, Margaret said quietly. Rachel's brow tightened. I am not going to. Listen. One word, soft. But it landed, because something inside Rachel had already heard it. That uneven hum, that slight drag in the rhythm. She hadn't named it, but now she couldn't ignore it. Another vibration rolled through the cabin. Stronger. Passengers shifted in their seats. A few voices rose.
What's happening? Is this normal?
The calm was breaking. Up front, the cockpit door remained closed. Locked. Standard procedure. Inside, Captain Daniel Brooks leaned forward, eyes locked on the engine display. Temperatures climbing, he said. Mark Ellis was already moving. Fuel flows unstable. I'm seeing pressure drops. His hands moved across the panel. Precise, fast, controlled. But his breathing had changed. Shorter, faster. Because this wasn't routine anymore. Back in the aisle, Rachel exhaled slowly. Her training told her to stop this, control the passenger, maintain order. But her instincts were starting to say something else. Margaret leaned in slightly. Not aggressive, not threatening, just closer. You don't have time to be wrong, she said. Rachel felt it, that shift, that moment where authority stopped feeling solid. Ashley grabbed Rachel's arm. Don't, she whispered. We can't let her through. Rachel didn't answer, because she was listening now, really listening. The engine noise surged, then dipped, then surged again. Not smooth, not consistent. Her stomach tightened. Something was off, and suddenly Margaret wasn't the problem anymore. Rachel stepped aside. Just half a step. Small, but enough. Ashley's eyes widened. Rachel, what are you doing? Margaret didn't wait. She moved past them, toward the cockpit. Ashley reached out, grabbing her wrist. You're not authorized. Margaret stopped, turned, and for the first time, her voice carried something sharp. Neither is hesitation when people's lives are at risk. Ashley froze. The words hit harder than the grip. Margaret pulled her hand free, not violently, just decisively, and kept walking. Passengers watched, some confused, some afraid, some starting to understand. Sophie's camera followed every step. Her heart was pounding now. "This is not normal," she whispered. "This is not normal." Margaret reached the cockpit door. She didn't knock immediately. She listened first, head slightly tilted, counting, timing, confirming. Inside, the alarm finally sounded. A sharp tone cut through the cockpit. Mark cursed under his breath, left engines exceeding limits. Daniel's jaw tightened. Throttle back. "I'm trying." The aircraft dipped slightly, a subtle loss of balance. Corrected, but not clean. Margaret raised her hand and knocked. 3 short. Too long. 3 short. The pattern was precise, not random. Inside the cockpit, both pilots froze. Daniel looked at Mark.
What the hell was that?
Mark's eyes narrowed. That's not a passenger knock. Another vibration hit. Harder. The aircraft shuddered. Passengers gasped. A woman screamed. Margaret knocked again. Same pattern. Exact. Inside, Daniel made a decision against protocol, against training, but not against instinct. "Open it." Mark hesitated. "Are you sure? No time." The lock disengaged. The door cracked open. Daniel expected confusion, panic, a problem he could manage. Instead, he saw Margaret, standing still, calm, focused, like she had been here before, many times. "Who are you?" Daniel asked. Margaret met his eyes, and for the first time she answered fully. "Margaret Hayes," she said, a beat, then retired Air Force, Aviation Systems Command. Silence. Not long, but enough. Everything shifted. Mark stared at her, trying to process. Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped back. "Get in." Margaret moved into the cockpit. The door closed behind her, sealing off the chaos. Inside, the air felt different, tighter, more focused, more real. Margaret's eyes went straight to the panel, scanning, reading, understanding, fast, very fast. "Left engine instability," she said, not asking. Mark nodded. "Temperature spike, pressure fluctuations. We're trying to stabilize." Margaret leaned closer. Her eyes moved across the data, then stopped. There, a detail, small but critical. "You're compensating too late," she said. Daniel frowned.
What?
"The delay in your correction. It's feeding the instability." Mark blinked. "That's not possible. The system is lagging." Her voice cut through, clean, certain, manual override. "Now." Mark hesitated. Daniel didn't. "Do it." Hands moved. Switches flipped. The system shifted. The engine sounds changed. Still rough, but different. Margaret listened, measured, adjusted. Again, she said, "Faster this time." Mark followed, this time without hesitation. The aircraft steadied slightly. Not safe. Not yet. But better. Behind the door, the cabin held its breath. Ashley stood frozen in the aisle. Rachel beside her. Neither speaking, neither moving, because they both knew. Everything had changed. The woman they tried to remove was now the only reason this plane still had a chance. The cockpit fell into a different kind of silence, not quiet, focused. Every sound had meaning now. Every second mattered. Margaret didn't sit. She stood just behind the pilots, one hand resting lightly on the back of Mark's seat, eyes locked on the instrument panel. "Hold that input," she said. Mark kept his hand steady on the controls. The engine whine shifted again, less chaotic, still unstable, but no longer spiraling. Daniel glanced at her. "You've seen this before." It wasn't a question. Margaret didn't look at him. "Not exactly this configuration," she said, "but close enough." Another tremor rolled through the aircraft, short, sharp. Mark exhaled through his teeth. "We're losing margin." Margaret nodded once. "I know." Her eyes quickly across the displays. Temperature, pressure, fuel flow, all connected, all feeding into each other, like a system trying to correct itself and failing. "Your correction window is too wide," she said. Daniel frowned. "Explain." "You're waiting for full deviation before reacting. That lag is pushing the system further out of balance." Mark shook his head slightly. "That's how it's designed. You don't overcorrect or you lose control slower." Margaret cut in. "A beat. Then, or you stabilize faster." Silence. Daniel made the call. "Tighten the window." Mark adjusted. Smaller inputs, faster response. The engine sound shifted again. Not smooth, but tighter, more contained. Margaret listened. Her head tilted slightly. "Yes," she said. "That's it." Outside the cockpit, the cabin was no longer calm, not yet panic, but close. Voices were rising, people asking questions, looking around, searching for answers no one was giving. Ashley stood in the aisle, trying to maintain control. Everyone stay seated. Keep your seatbelts fastened. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. Rachel moved beside her, more grounded, more present. She leaned toward a passenger who was starting to stand. "Sit down, sir," she said. Firm, direct. He hesitated, then obeyed, because her tone left no room for argument. But her eyes flicked toward the cockpit door, again and again, because now she knew she had been wrong. And the weight of that realization was starting to settle. In first class, Richard Collins wasn't speaking anymore. His drink sat untouched, his fingers gripping the armrest. Linda stared straight ahead, her earlier certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, fear. In row 4, Sophie didn't lower her phone. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "She's in the cockpit," she said, to the world watching her screen. "She's actually in the cockpit." The comments flooded in, faster than she could read. But she didn't need to. She could feel it, the shift. The story wasn't about discrimination anymore. It was about survival. Back inside the cockpit, Margaret stepped closer. "Engine response is improving," she said. Mark nodded. "But it's still fluctuating." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Because the route isn't fixed." Daniel's grip tightened on the controls.
So what are we dealing with?
Margaret took a breath, measured, controlled. "Thermal imbalance feeding into fuel instability," she said. Mark blinked. "That shouldn't escalate this fast." "It wouldn't," Margaret replied, "if everything else was perfect." A pause, then it's not. Another alarm chirped, short, sharp. Daniel swore under his breath. "We're not going to hold this forever." Margaret nodded. "I know." She looked up. Out the front window, the Zaska stretched ahead, clear, endless, and completely irrelevant, because the problem wasn't out there, it was inside. "Where's the nearest divert option?" she asked. Mark was already checking. "Denver is still closest." Daniel nodded. "We turned back." Margaret didn't argue. "Do it now." Daniel banked the aircraft. A slow turn, controlled. But the shift in direction made the instability more noticeable. The engine protested, a deeper vibration, a harsher tone. Margaret braced slightly. "Ease the transition," she said. "Don't force it." Daniel adjusted, smaller movements, more precise. The aircraft responded, barely, but enough. Behind them, the cabin tilted. Passengers gasped. A woman cried out. Ashley grabbed the back of a seat to steady herself. "What's happening?" Someone shouted. Rachel stepped forward. "We are adjusting our flight path. Stay seated." Her voice cut through the noise, not loud, but strong, because now she believed there was a reason. Back in the cockpit, Margaret's focus never broke. "We're buying time," she said. Mark nodded, but not much. Margaret's jaw tightened. She knew that. Time was the one thing they didn't have. Her eyes moved again, searching, analyzing. Then there, a small detail, easy to miss, a pattern in the fluctuation. Not random, not chaotic, predictable, if you knew what to look for. "The spike isn't constant," she said. "It's cycling." Mark leaned in. "You're right." Daniel glanced between them. "Meaning?" Margaret's voice dropped slightly. More precise, more intense. "We can work with it." A beat. Then, but we have to match it. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Tell us how." Margaret stepped closer. Her presence filled the space now, not because she was louder, but because she was certain. "On the next drop," she said, eyes locked on the readings, "adjust before it hits." Mark's hands hovered over the controls, waiting, watching. The numbers dipped. Margaret spoke. Now, Mark moved. Quick, precise. The engine responded, not perfectly, but better, much better. The vibration softened, just a fraction, but it was enough to feel, enough to believe. Daniel exhaled slowly. "That's working." Margaret didn't smile. "Do it again." And in that moment, the balance of the entire aircraft shifted. Not physically, but in control. Because the woman they had pushed to the back of the plane was now the only one who understood how to keep it in the air. The rhythm held for a moment, then slipped again, a small drop, a quick spike. The engine didn't fail, but it fought. Margaret's eyes stayed locked on the pattern. "Again," she said. Mark followed. Input before the drop. Correct before the surge. The engine responded. not stable, but less chaotic. Daniel adjusted the aircraft's pitch slightly. Speed is dropping, he said. We're trading stability for lift. Margaret nodded. I know. Her voice stayed calm, but her mind was moving fast. Too many variables. Too little time. Keep the nose where it is, she said. Don't chase the speed yet. Daniel hesitated. That went against instinct, against training. You sure? Margaret didn't look at him. If you chase it, you'll overload the system. A beat. Then, trust me, Daniel did. Not because he knew her, because he saw the results. The engine stabilized again. Just enough. Mark exhaled. That bought us something. Margaret shook her head. Not enough. Another vibration. Shorter this time. Sharper. The aircraft shivered, like something inside it was trying to break free. Outside the cockpit, the cabin had changed. Fear was no longer quiet. A man stood up halfway before Rachel pushed him back into his seat. Sit down, she said. Her voice didn't shake anymore, because now she understood the stakes. A child cried louder. A woman whispered prayers. Ashley moved through the aisle, her steps quick but careful. Stay seated. We're returning to the airport. Her voice carried now, more authority, more urgency. Passengers listened, because they could feel it. Something was wrong, and no one was pretending otherwise anymore. In first class, Richard's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his glass. He didn't drink. He just held it, like something solid might steady him. Linda stared out the window. The ground was farther away now, but it didn't feel safe. Nothing did. In row 4, Sophie's voice cracked as she spoke to her camera. They're turning back, she said. I think something's wrong with the engine. Her breath caught. But the woman, she's still in there. Her eyes flicked toward the cockpit door. That woman they tried to remove, she's in control now. The comments surged, but Sophie barely saw them, because this wasn't a story anymore.
It was real.
Back in the cockpit, Margaret leaned in closer. Her finger hovered just above her reading. There, she said. Mark followed her gaze. Fuel pressure dip. Margaret nodded.
That's your trigger.
Daniel frowned. For what? Margaret's voice sharpened. For everything. She turned slightly. Looked at both of them. Your system isn't failing randomly. A beat. It's reacting. Mark blinked.
To what?
Margaret's eyes narrowed. Heat. Silence. Then, that spike you're seeing is not the problem. Another beat. It's the warning. Daniel's grip tightened. So, what's the problem? Margaret answered without hesitation. Thermal runaway risk. The words landed heavy. Mark's face changed. That wasn't minor. That wasn't manageable. That was dangerous. How long? He asked. Margaret didn't soften it. Not long. The cockpit air tightened. Every second counted now. Daniel made the call. We need to get on the ground. Fast. Margaret nodded. Yes. But her eyes stayed on the panel. Not like this. Mark looked at her.
What do you mean?
Margaret's voice dropped. If you push for speed right now, you could trigger a full failure. Silence. Then we manage it down. Daniel exhaled slowly, controlled, measured. Tell us how. Margaret didn't hesitate. We follow the cycle. Mark's hands hovered again, ready, waiting. The drop is your window, she said. When it dips, you adjust. Daniel nodded.
And the climb?
Margaret's eyes flicked up. We ride it, simple, but not easy. Mark swallowed. Okay, the next cycle came. Dip. Margaret spoke now. Mark adjusted. Smooth, controlled. The engine responded. Less resistance this time. Daniel held the pitch steady. Didn't chase. Didn't force. The aircraft settled slightly. Not safe, but controlled. Margaret exhaled, barely. That's it. They repeated it. Again and again. Each time a little cleaner. Each time a little more stable. Not perfect, but improving. Outside, the sky stretched wide and indifferent. Inside, every movement mattered. Back in the cabin, Rachel felt it. The change, subtle, but real. The shaking wasn't as violent, the noise less erratic. She looked toward the cockpit door again. And for the first time, she felt something else. Not just fear, hope. Ashley noticed it too. Her shoulders dropped slightly. What's happening? She whispered. Rachel didn't take her eyes off the front. She's helping them, she said. Ashley swallowed. The words hit hard, because now she understood, fully, the woman she had judged, dismissed, humiliated, was the reason they were still in the air. In first class, Richard leaned back slowly. He felt it, the shift, the control returning. His grip loosened, Just slightly. Linda closed her eyes, not in fear, in relief. In row 4, Sophie wiped at her eyes without realizing it. They're stabilizing, she whispered. I think they're stabilizing. Her voice broke, not from fear, from the weight of what she was witnessing. Back in the cockpit, Margaret didn't relax. Not yet. Her eyes stayed sharp, focused, because this wasn't over. Not even close. We're buying time, she said. Daniel nodded. How much? Margaret didn't answer right away. She listened, measured, calculated. Then enough if we don't make another mistake. Silence filled the cockpit, heavy, real. Because now, it wasn't just about the plane. It was about every decision they made next and whether they deserved to land. The descent began slowly, not dramatic, not sudden. Just a subtle lowering of the nose, a controlled fall. Daniel eased the aircraft down with careful hands. No rush, no force, because rushing would break what little balance they had built. Margaret watched the instruments without blinking.
Keep it shallow,
She said. Daniel nodded. I am. Mark checked the altitude. We're starting down. His voice was steadier now, not calm, but focused. The kind of focus that comes when fear has nowhere left to go. Another cycle hit. The engine dipped. Margaret spoke. Now. Mark adjusted. Faster this time. Cleaner. The response came quicker. The vibration softened again. Small progress, but real. Daniel exhaled. We're holding. Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes moved hands across the panel again, always searching, always measuring, because holding wasn't enough. They needed to survive the next phase. Descent changed everything. Air pressure, temperature, load. Every shift could push the system too far. Watch the heat curve, she said. Mark nodded. I see it rising again. Margaret leaned closer. Don't let it peak. Daniel frowned. That's not fully in our control. Margaret's voice stayed steady. It is, if you stay ahead of it. Another dip, another correction. The pattern held, for now. Behind them, the cabin felt different, less chaotic, but not calm. Passengers were quieter now, listening, feeling every movement of the plane, every sound. Rachel moved down the aisle slowly, checking seat belts, making eye contact, not just doing her job, connecting, because now she understood something she hadn't before. People didn't just need rules.
They needed trust.
She stopped beside the young mother, kneeling slightly. Hey, she said softly. We're heading back. The pilots are working on it. You're okay. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. But she believed her. Not because Rachel sounded confident, because she sounded honest. Ashley watched from a few rows back. Her expression had changed. No more sharp edges, no more control for control's sake. Just awareness and regret. She looked toward the cockpit again, and for the first time, she hoped, not in the system, in a person. In first class, Richard leaned forward, watching the aisle, watching the crew, watching everything he had ignored before. Linda spoke quietly.
Do you feel that?
Richard nodded. It's smoother, but his voice wasn't certain, because smoother didn't mean safe.
Not yet.
In row 4, Sophie wiped her face again. Her phone was still recording, but now she wasn't narrating. She was just watching, living it. Her voice came back, soft. They're trying to land. A pause. I think they're trying to land. Back in the cockpit, Margaret straightened slightly. We need to prepare for the worst case, she said. Daniel's eyes flicked to her. What does that look like? Margaret didn't hesitate. Loss of thrust on final approach. Mark swallowed. That's not ideal. Margaret's tone stayed level. It's manageable. A beat. If you're ready for it. Daniel nodded once. Then we get ready. Margaret pointed to the panel. Run through your emergency glide options. Mark was already moving. Checklist, calculations, angles, speeds, everything adjusted for what might happen. Not what they hoped would happen. The aircraft dipped again. Stronger this time. The engine growled, a rough sound, ugly. Margaret's eyes sharpened. Stay with it. Mark adjusted. Fast, precise. The engine steadied, barely. Daniel tightened his grip. How far out are we? Mark checked. Not far. Margaret exhaled slowly. Good, then, because it's getting worse. Silence. Heavy. Real. The pattern was tightening. The dips sharper. The spikes higher. Less room. Less time. Daniel nodded. We finished this. Not a question. A statement. Margaret looked at him. Really looked this time. And saw it. The shift. He wasn't just flying anymore. He was leading. She gave a small nod. Then don't hesitate. Another cycle. Faster. Harder. Margaret spoke now. Mark moved. The correction hit. The engine responded. Not smoothly, but enough. Daniel adjusted the descent, holding the line, holding the plane, holding everything together. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin held its breath. Rachel gripped the back of a seat, not from fear, from focus. Ashley stood still, not moving, not speaking, just listening, because now she knew everything depended on what was happening on the other side of that door. In first class, Richards closed his eyes, not in defeat, in reflection, because for the first time he understood how wrong he had been and how close they all were to paying for it. In row 4, Sophie whispered again, "Come on." Not to the camera, not to the world, to them, to the people fighting to keep the plane in the air. Back in the cockpit, Margaret's voice cut through the noise. Final phase. Daniel nodded. "Let's bring it home." And in that moment, 3 people who had never met before today became the only thing standing between life and a mistake no one would survive. The runway lights appeared in the distance, small at first, then clearer, a line of white cutting through the dark. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I have visual." His voice was steady, but tighter than before. Mark adjusted the descent profile. "We're a little high." Margaret didn't look up, corrected gradually. Daniel nodded. No sudden moves. The aircraft responded slowly, heavy, like it didn't fully trust its own systems anymore. Another cycle hit, harder. The engine dropped, then surged, louder than before. The cockpit shook. Margaret's voice cut in instantly. "Now." Mark adjusted, faster, more aggressive. The response came, but delayed, too delayed. Margaret's jaw tightened, it's slipping. Daniel kept his hand steady. "Hold it." The runway grew larger, closer, but not close enough. Not yet. Behind them, the cabin had gone silent. No more questions, no more panic, just waiting. Rachel stood near the front, her hand pressed flat against the bulkhead, feeling every vibration, every shift. Her eyes were fixed on the cockpit door. Ashley stood a few rows behind. She wasn't giving instructions anymore, wasn't trying to control anything. She just watched and listened, because now she understood something simple. Control isn't about power. It's about knowing when you don't have it. In first class, Richard gripped the armrest again, but this time he wasn't angry. He wasn't judgmental. He was just human. Linda whispered something under her breath, a prayer, or maybe just a hope. In row 4, Sophie lowered her phone slightly, not because she stopped recording, because her hands were shaking. "They're landing," she whispered, her voice barely there. "They're actually landing." Back in the cockpit, Margaret stepped closer, her eyes locked on the glide path. "Speed is dropping too fast." Mark nodded. "I see it." Daniel adjusted the throttle, careful, measured. The engine responded, but slower now, less reliable. Margaret spoke again. "Don't wait for it." Daniel glanced at her, meaning, anticipate the drop, a beat, stay ahead of it. The next cycle came. Margaret didn't wait. Now, Mark adjusted early. The engine responded better, not perfect, but enough. The aircraft steadied, just a little. Daniel exhaled. That's it. The runway lights stretched wider, closer now. Real. Mark checked the altitude. "We're coming in." Margaret nodded. "Stay with the pattern." Her voice didn't change, didn't rise, didn't rush, because panic would break everything. Another vibration, sharper, more violent. The cockpit rattled. An alarm flashed. Mark's eyes widened. Temperature spike. Margaret's voice cut through. "Ignore the number. Watch the response." Daniel didn't hesitate. He held the line, didn't chase the spike, didn't react too fast. The engine screamed, then dipped. Margaret spoke, now. Mark corrected. Harder this time. The engine stabilized. Barely, but it held. Daniel's hands tightened. "We're running out of margin." Margaret nodded. "I know." Her eyes flicked up. The runway filled the window now. Close, very close, but still dangerous. "Final correction window," she said. Daniel's voice was low. "Then we make it count." The aircraft descended, lower, closer. The ground rising fast now. Too fast. Mark adjusted. Margaret watched, waiting, timing. The engine dipped again. Margaret's voice snapped, now. Mark moved. Everything hit at once. The correction, the descent, the speed, the balance. For a split second, it felt wrong. Like too much, like too late. The aircraft dropped, hard. Passengers screamed. Rachel's grip tightened. Ashley closed her eyes. Sophie gasped. Richard leaned forward. Linda cried out, and then the engine caught. The correction held, the aircraft leveled. Just enough, just in time. Daniel pulled gently, not too much, just enough to guide it in. The runway rushed beneath them, fast, unforgiving. Margaret didn't speak, not now. This part belonged to the pilot. Daniel focused. Everything else disappeared. No past, no fear. Just this moment. This landing. The wheels hit. Hard. A jolt that ran through the entire aircraft. But they held. The second set hit. Then the third. The plane bounced once. Then settled. Speed still high. Too high. Daniel engaged reverse thrust. The engine roared again. But this time, it worked. The aircraft slowed. Fast. But controlled. Margaret watched the gauges, watching for failure, for collapse, for anything, nothing. The speed dropped, more, until finally the plane rose, slower, steadier, alive. Silence hit the cabin, not immediately, but like a wave. Shock, then sound, crying, laughing, breathing, people realizing they were still here. Rachel let go of the bulkhead, her hands shaking. Ashley covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. In first class, Richard leaned back. Completely still. Linda sobbed quietly. In row 4, Sophie dropped her head, her phone still recording. But she wasn't watching it anymore. She was just breathing. Back in the cockpit, Daniel exhaled. Long, deep. We made it. Mark leaned back in his seat, hands shaking now, yeah. A pause. Then, yeah, we did. Margaret didn't smile. Not yet. She looked at the panel one more time. Checked. Confirmed. Then finally, she stepped back. Quiet. Calm. Like she had never been part of the chaos. But everything in that cockpit knew the truth. They didn't make it alone. They made it because someone they almost ignored refused to let them fail. The aircraft slowed to a crawl, then stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Not the passengers, not the crew, not even the air inside the cabin. It felt like the entire plane was holding its breath. Then it broke. A sob, a laugh. A voice saying, "Thank God," from somewhere in the middle rows. The sound spread, not loud, but real. People breathing again, people realizing they were still alive. Rachel leaned her head back against the wall, her eyes closed for just a second. Not relief, not yet. Something heavier, something closer to truth. Ashley stepped into the aisle slowly. Her legs felt unsteady, not from the landing, from everything before it. She looked around, at the faces, at the passengers she had tried to control. Now she saw something different. Not problems, not risks. People, real people. And for the first time she felt ashamed. In first class, Richard didn't move. His hands rested on his knees now. No tension. No anger.
Just stillness.
Linda wiped her face with trembling fingers. "I thought," she whispered. But she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Everyone knew what she meant. In row 4, Sophie finally lowered her phone completely. Her screen still lit, still recording. But she wasn't holding it up anymore. She was just staring forward, at the cockpit door, waiting, because she knew, everyone knew, the story wasn't finished, not yet. Inside the cockpit, the air was different, quieter, heavier. Daniel removed his headset slowly. His hands were still shaking, not violently, but enough. Mark leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed for a second, then opened again, like he didn't trust the moment to last. Margaret stood near the door, exactly where she had been, not sitting, not relaxing, just present. Daniel turned to her for the first time, without urgency, without pressure. "Margaret," he said. Her name felt different now. Not just a name, recognition, respect. "You saved us." Margaret shook her head slightly. "No," she said. Her voice was calm. "You flew the plane." Daniel let out a short breath. "That's not what I meant." Margaret met his eyes. "I know." A pause. "Then you did your job, I did mine. Simple, clear, but it landed deeper than any praise." Mark sat forward again, looking at her, really looking. "You knew what was happening before we did." Margaret didn't answer right away. She glanced once at the instrument panel, then back at him. "I heard it," she said. Mark frowned. "Heard it?" Margaret nodded. "The engine tells you everything if you know how to listen." Silence, not disbelief, understanding. Because now he did. Daniel stood up slowly, his legs steadier now. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret waited. Why didn't you say who you were? The question hung there, not accusing, just honest. Margaret looked at him, then toward the cockpit door, then back. Would it have changed anything? Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped, because he knew the answer. It should have. But it wouldn't have. Not at the beginning. Not when assumptions had already been made. Rachel stood just outside the cockpit. She had heard enough. Not everything, but enough. Her hand hovered near the door. Then she knocked softly, this time like a passenger. Daniel opened it. Rachel stepped in, her posture straight, but her eyes different. She looked at Margaret, not with authority, not with judgment, with something else, something quieter. I owe you an apology, Rachel said. No hesitation, no excuse. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She just watched her. Rachel continued. I made a decision based on what I thought I saw, not what was real. Her voice didn't shake, but it carried weight. I didn't listen. A pause. Then, and that could have cost lives. Silence filled the cockpit again, heavy, but honest. Margaret stepped closer, not confrontational, not distant, just present. You followed your training, she said. Rachel shook her head. I followed my assumptions. Margaret held her gaze. That's not the same thing. The words landed, deep, because Rachel knew it was true. Behind her, Ashley appeared in the doorway. She didn't step in. She just stood there, listening, her face pale, her eyes filled with something she hadn't shown before. I'm sorry, Ashley said. The words came out quickly, like they had been waiting. I thought I was doing my job. Margaret looked at her. You were. Ashley blinked, confused. Margaret continued. But your job isn't just to enforce rules. A beat is to understand people. Ashley swallowed, her throat tight. I didn't. Margaret didn't soften it. No, she said, you didn't. The truth sat there, uncomfortable, but necessary. Rachel stepped back slightly, giving space, not because she had to, because she chose to. Daniel looked between them, then back at Margaret. You should be the one making the announcement, he said. Margaret shook her head.
That's your role.
Daniel nodded slowly, but he didn't argue, because he understood. Leadership wasn't about taking credit, it was about knowing your place. He stepped forward, reaching for the intercom. The cabin waited. Every passenger, every breath, every heartbeat, waiting for someone to explain what just happened and why they were still here. Daniel pressed the intercom. The soft click echoed through the cabin. Every sound stopped, every voice faded. Passengers leaned forward, waiting, listening. Daniel took a breath, not rushed, not forced. Measured. This is Captain Daniel Brooks speaking. His voice carried, calm, clear, different now. We are safely on the ground. A wave moved through the cabin, not loud but powerful. Relief, real. Some people cried, some laughed, some just sat there staring, trying to process it. Daniel continued. We experienced a critical engine issue during climb. A pause, not for drama, for truth. Our crew worked together to bring the aircraft down safely. He could have stopped there, most would have, but he didn't. However, that word changed the room again. Every ear sharpened, every breath slowed. We had help. Silence, pure, focused. Daniel's voice softened slightly. There was someone on board with experience far beyond what we expected. In row 4, Sophie sat up straighter, her eyes locked on the cockpit door. In first class, Richard leaned forward again, listening, really listening this time. Rachel stood still in the aisle, Ashley beside her, neither moving, because they knew what was coming. Inside the cockpit, Margaret didn't move, didn't react. She just stood there, quiet. Daniel continued. Her name is Margaret Hayes. A ripple moved through the cabin, soft, confused, curious, but building. She is a retired United States Air Force Aviation Systems commander. The words hit hard. People looked at each other, at the aisle, at the front, trying to connect the name to the woman they had seen, the woman they had judged, the woman they had ignored. Sophie's hand tightened around her phone, her voice barely a whisper. Oh my God, in first class, Richard's face changed. Completely. Not disbelief, realization. Linda covered her mouth, tears falling freely now. Daniel's voice remained steady. She recognized the issue before we did. A pause, and she helped guide our response when it mattered most. Rachel closed her eyes, just for a second, Because now everyone knew. Ashley felt it hit her chest. Heavy, sharp, unavoidable. The truth, out in the open, no place to hide from it. In the cabin, people began to turn, looking back, looking for her, row by row, searching. Margaret. The name moved through the space like a current. In row 38, the empty seat beside where she had been sat quietly, a silent reminder of where she had been placed, of what had almost happened. Sophie stood up slightly, not fully, just enough to look, to see, to understand. Daniel finished. On behalf of the entire crew and every passenger on this aircraft, a breath, a real one, thank you. He released the intercom. The silence held for half a second. Then applause, not loud at first, scattered, uneven, then growing, stronger, real. Passengers clapped, some standing, some crying, some just staring forward, hands trembling as they brought them together. It wasn't about celebration. It was about recognition, about truth, about something bigger than themselves. Rachel stepped back into the aisle. The sound hit her. Each clap felt like a reminder, not of what was done right, of what had almost gone wrong. Ashley didn't clap. She couldn't. Her hands stayed at her sides, because for her, this wasn't a moment of pride. It was a moment of understanding. And it hurt. In first class, Richard stood slowly, his applause steady, measured, but his eyes weren't proud. They were humbled. Linda stood beside him, clapping through tears, because she knew
They had been wrong.
so wrong. Back in the cockpit, Daniel turned to Margaret. The applause echoed faintly through the door. He gave a small nod. They know. Margaret didn't react, not outwardly. She just listened to the sound, to the meaning behind it. Then she spoke, quiet, almost to herself. They didn't need to. Daniel frowned slightly.
What do you mean?
Margaret looked at him. Respect shouldn't come after proof. The words settled, deep. Mark looked down at the panel, not because there was anything left to check, because he needed a second to sit with that. Rachel stepped back into the cockpit doorway. She heard it, every word. And this time, she didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't defend. She just nodded, because now she understood. Out in the cabin, the applause slowly faded, but the feeling didn't. It stayed in the silence that followed, in the way people looked at each other, in the way they looked at the front of the plane. Something had shifted, not just in the air, in them. Sophie raised her phone again, not to capture the moment, but to say something. Her voice was steady now, stronger. This isn't just about a flight, she said. This is about how fast we decide who matters and how wrong we can be. She lowered the phone because that was enough, more than enough. Back in the cockpit, Margaret stepped toward the door, ready to leave, ready to return to the place she had been sent. Not because she belonged there, because that was where she had been placed. Daniel noticed. You don't have to go back there, he said. Margaret paused, just for a second, then turned, her expression calm, controlled. I was never out of place, she said. A beat. They just didn't see it. And with that, she stepped out of the cockpit, back into the cabin, not as someone different, not as someone changed, but as someone finally seen. Margaret stepped into the aisle, and the entire cabin shifted toward her, not physically, emotionally. Eyes followed her, every row, every seat. People who hadn't noticed her before saw her now, really saw her, not the jacket, not the worn bag, not the quiet posture. Her. Rachel moved first. She stepped forward into the aisle, standing directly in Margaret's path. Not blocking, not commanding, just present. For a second, neither of them spoke. The silence carried more weight than anything said before. Then Rachel lowered her gaze slightly. A small movement, but significant. I was wrong, she said. Her voice was steady. No excuses. No explanations, just truth. Margaret stopped, looked at her, not cold, not forgiving, just clear. Yes, she said, the word landed, not harsh, but honest. Rachel nodded once, accepting it. I didn't listen, she added. Margaret stuttered for a moment, then spoke. You listened, she said. Rachel looked up, confused. Margaret continued. You just listened to the wrong things. A beat, then appearance, assumptions, comfort. Rachel exhaled slowly because she knew it was true. Ashley stood a few steps behind, her hands clasped tightly together. She didn't step forward right away, didn't interrupt, because this wasn't about her yet. But the moment found her anyway. I judged you, Ashley said. The words came out quickly. Before she could stop them, Margaret turned her head slightly. Ashley stepped closer, her voice softer now. I thought I was protecting the cabin. A pause, but I was protecting an idea. Margaret held her gaze. And people aren't ideas, she said. Ashley swallowed, her eyes filled. No, she said quietly, they're not. The truth settled between them, not dramatic, not loud, just real. Around them, passengers watched, not as spectators anymore, as witnesses. In first class, Richard stood fully now. He didn't stay in his space, didn't stay comfortable. He stepped into the aisle, slowly, deliberately. Linda followed. Neither of them spoke right away, because words felt smaller now. Richard stopped a few feet away, looking at Margaret, his expression stripped of everything it had before. No confidence, no authority, just humility. I owe you more than thanks, he said. His voice was quiet, measured. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She let him finish. I thought I understood how the world worked, he continued. A breath.
I was wrong.
Margaret nodded slightly. Yes, she said again, same word, same weight. But this time it carried something else, not judgment, acceptance. Linda stepped forward, tears still on her face. We all were, she said softly. Margaret looked at her, and for the first time her expression softened. Just a fraction, not because of the apology, because of the honesty. In row 4, Sophie stood now, not recording, not documenting, just present. She stepped into the aisle slowly, watching the moment unfold. Then she spoke, not loud, but clear. This is what it looks like, she said. People turned toward her, listening. Not the landing, she continued, not the engine. A pause, this. She gestured lightly, to Margaret, to the crew, to everyone. This is what matters. Silence followed, deep, thoughtful, because she was right. Margaret glanced at her briefly, a small acknowledgement. Then she looked down the aisle, back toward row 38.
Her seat, the place she had been sent.
Rachel noticed. You don't have to go back there, she said. Ashley nodded quickly. We can move you. Margaret stopped, turned slightly, looked at both of them. Why? She asked. The question wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It was simple, direct. Rachel hesitated because the answer wasn't simple. Not anymore. Ashley tried. Because you deserve better. Margaret held her gaze. I always did, she said. A beat. You just didn't think so. Ashley lowered her eyes. Rachel didn't argue. Because they both knew this wasn't about a seat. It never had been. Margaret turned again and started walking. Not toward first class, not toward the front. Back, row by row, step by step, through the same aisle she had walked before. But everything had changed. Passengers moved their legs aside, not out of obligation, out of respect. Some nodded, some whispered thank you. Some just watched, trying to understand what they had missed. Richard stepped back into his seat, not because he wanted to, because he understood. This wasn't his space to step into anymore. Linda sat beside him, quiet, reflective. Sophie stayed standing for a moment longer, then slowly sat back down, her eyes following Margaret, not as a subject, as a person. Margaret reached row 38. Her seat waited, unchanged. She paused for a second, then sat down. Same posture, same calm, like nothing had happened, but everything had. The man beside her looked at her differently now. Not curious, not casual, respectful. I'm glad you were on this plane, he said. Margaret glanced at him, a small nod. So am I, she replied. Up front, Rachel leaned against the bulkhead again. But this time, she didn't close her eyes. She kept them open, watching, learning. Ashley stood beside her, silent, because there was nothing left to say, only something to remember. And in that quiet cabin, after everything, one truth remained. The most important thing on that plane was never the seat. It was the way they chose to see each other, and what it cost when they didn't. The cabin lights dimmed slowly, but no one really relaxed. Not completely. Something has shifted, and once people see clearly, it is hard to go back. Margaret sat still in row 38, hands folded gently in her lap. Her breathing was even, her eyes calm, but inside something deeper was settling. Not anger, not victory. Clarity, the kind that comes when truth no longer needs to fight. Up front, Rachel moved again, not quickly, not with urgency, but with intention. She walked down the aisle, past first class, past the quiet glances, past the subtle nods from passengers who now saw her differently too, because she had changed. Not perfectly, but honestly. Ashley followed a few steps behind, not leading, not hiding, just present. They stopped at row 38. Rachel didn't speak right away. She crouched slightly, lowering herself to Margaret's level. Not above, not in control. Equal. "I've been thinking," she said quietly. Margaret turned her head, watching her. Rachel continued, "I've done this job for years." A breath. "I thought I knew people." Her voice faltered just a little, but I didn't know how to see them. Margaret held her gaze, steady. Rachel didn't look away this time. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Silence. Heavy. Real. Margaret tilted her head slightly, then asked softly, "Then who do you want to be?" Rachel didn't answer right away, because this time she wasn't guessing. She was choosing. "Someone who pauses," she said. A second longer. Another breath. "Someone who listens before deciding." Margaret nodded slowly. That answer meant something. Ashley stepped forward, her voice smaller, but clearer than before. "I used to think respect came from control," she said. Margaret looked at her. Ashley swallowed. "But now I see it comes from restraint, a pause, and humility." Margaret's eyes softened again, just slightly, because those words were earned, not performed. Behind them, the man sitting next to Margaret shifted. He leaned forward a little. "I've been on flights my whole life," he said, his tone thoughtful. "I've never seen anything like this." He looked at Margaret, then at Rachel, then Ashley. "You changed more than a seat today." The sentence stayed in the air, because it was true, and everyone knew it. Rachel stood up slowly. She didn't try to fix anything, didn't offer upgrades, didn't promise anything, because some things don't need to be fixed. They need to be understood. "We'll remember this," she said, not as a statement, as a commitment. Margaret gave a small nod. "That's enough," she replied. Rachel stepped back. Ashley followed, but neither of them turned away immediately. They stood there for a second longer, letting the moment stay. Then they walked back toward the front. Different, not in uniform, in awareness. Time passed quietly. The plane moved steadily through the night. The hum of the engine softened into the background. Passengers shifted. Some slept. Some stared into the dark windows, thinking, replaying, understanding. In first class, Richard leaned back in his seat, but he wasn't comfortable. Not in the old way. He looked down at his hands, then over at Linda. "She didn't need to prove anything," he said quietly. Linda shook her head. "No," she replied. "She just needed us to see it." Richard nodded slowly. And for the first time in a long time, he questioned something deeper than money, something deeper than status, value, real value, not what people show, what they carry. Hours later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm. Professional. "We'll be landing shortly." The words felt normal, routine. But nothing about this flight felt routine anymore. As the plane descended, the cabin prepared. Seats upright, belts fastened, lights softened. Margaret looked out the window. City lights stretched below, quiet, endless. She didn't smile, but she wasn't heavy either. She was steady, because she hadn't changed who she was. She had simply refused to become smaller. When the plane touched down, it was smooth, controlled, like everything else that had unfolded. The wheels met the ground, a soft thud, a long breath, and then movement. Passengers began to stand, slowly, carefully. But something else happened too. People looked at each other. Not quickly, not dismissively, longer, more aware. Margaret stayed seated, letting the aisle clear, no rush, no need. Rachel stood near the front again, but this time she wasn't directing. She was watching, making sure, not controlling, just present. Ashley helped an older passenger with a bag, gently, without being asked, without needing credit. Margaret finally stood, picked up her bag. Simple, unremarkable, except now it wasn't. As she walked forward, people made space again, not because of rules, because of recognition. She reached the exit, paused for a brief moment. Rachel stood beside the door. Their eyes met, no words this time, none needed, just a quiet understanding. Margaret stepped off the plane, into the terminal, into the crowd, and disappeared. Not as someone small, as someone complete. Rachel exhaled slowly. Ashley stood beside her. Neither of them spoke, because they both knew this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of how they would move forward, better, slower, wiser, more human. And somewhere in that crowded terminal, A's story stayed behind, not written, not announced, but felt. A story about judgment, about power, about what it means to truly see another person. And if that moment meant something to you, if you've ever been underestimated or overlooked or reduced to something smaller than who you are, then carry this with you. Choose to see people fully. Choose to pause. Choose respect. And if this story stayed with you, take a second to like this video. Subscribe for more stories that matter. And drop 3 simple words in the comments. Something real, something you believe in, something like stay strong always, or respect comes first, or truth always wins. Because sometimes 3 words can't say everything.